It is just about time to get started, but we'll give folks another minute or two to come in. For those of you that are joining us, A, it's good to see you, but B, would you mind putting your name, your organization, and just a tiny bit about you in the chat so we know a bit about who our audience is. So things like, are you a researcher? Are you a policymaker? Are you a funder? Are you something else? I love it because I'm seeing some familiar faces. Even people I don't know, but it was recently on other calls with, which is really exciting. All right, so I'm gonna ask Henry to kick us off this session. So Henry, why don't you take it away?
Great, thanks, Liz. Hi, folks, I'm Henry May. I'm the co-PI with Liz on the Center for Research, Use, and Education funded by IES. And this is the second workshop focused on use of surveys for measuring research use in education. And so we're going to be basing a lot of what we talk about today on our experience with the CREW project. This has been an interesting endeavor trying to measure research use with surveys and trying to deal with the numerous limitations of surveys with regards to desirability bias and identifying key informants and that sort of stuff. So we'll tell you a bit about what we've learned, some of the strategies that we found to be helpful. So today, Liz already talked about in the plenary some of the advantages of surveys. You can collect lots of data from lots and lots of people, but there, of course, are disadvantages, right? You have to know in advance what the right questions are. You can't, it's not like having a conversation or letting a respondent drive the discussion as you might in an interview. So there were some hard choices that we had to make along the way. We learned about some things that surveys worked well for, other things where we could sort of tweak and implement some, sort of, I would say, clever strategies for getting around some of the limitations. We'll share some of those strategies with you and some of the lessons that we've learned. Then we're going to break up into small groups and do a little bit of hands-on work with the survey. We've got a sort of trimmed down version of the survey that's got only a few sections represented in it, but it'll give you a chance to play around with it and see a couple of the things that we're using in our survey and how that works. Then what we'll do is we'll talk more broadly about the advantages of surveys. We'll discuss that, strategies that we use, strategies that others might use, and how this can be used in different contexts as well. So Liz, you can go on to the next slide. In the plenary, talked a lot about a number of advantages of the surveys. I'm going to focus on just a couple more, where I think that part of the biggest one is that for us, we didn't want to identify key informants in advance, right? We just basically wanted to capture the use of research in schools along with other forms of evidence to sort of give us the ability to make comparisons. But we wanted to do that across the entire school staff. It wasn't just the school administrators or organization-wide decisions. We also wanted to understand about decisions that individual teachers were making about what was happening in their classroom, or what interventionists were doing with regards to how they implemented either interventions or programs for individual kids. Adam, are you raising your hand?
Nope.
Okay. So what we did basically was we blanketed the entire faculty within a school, right? We gave the survey to the principal, to classroom teachers, to interventionists, anybody that had an instructional responsibility in the school, either in terms of a direct responsibility for engaging student learning or supervising instruction. And the idea was you sort of let the people who are in the know, you let the cream sort of rises to the top, right? And at the same time, by doing it in a survey, we then have a sort of fixed set of items where each person is getting the same item. And so you're able to make statistical comparisons across people and across organizations. And that's the other real benefit of surveys, because you can do that at scale. I'm going to hand it back to Liz. She'll talk a bit more about some of the limitations that we encountered.
Yeah, so one of the things I mentioned in the plenary was about some of the URE specific challenges of surveys. And I'll talk about them in this workshop as hard choices. And that really pertains to the larger concepts of research and use, right? So they're not monolithic sort of terms or concepts, right? People think about them in different ways. So when we think about use, we can think back to Carol Weiss's typologies, right? Instrumental, conceptual, maybe tactical or symbolic or imposed use. But even within instrumental use, we can think about the role of research in different ways. And people have different assumptions when they talk about research use about what that actual practice or behavior is. And so when designing a survey, you need to be really clear about those choices, because it's really unlikely that a survey has the ability to capture all those different kinds of use, right, for various reasons. So making a decision about, are we after instrumental use and what would it look like in a survey? Or are we after political use and how might we capture that, right? So making those hard choices is sort of a first step. When it comes to research, similarly, we have different conceptualizations of what that might mean. So we know policy pushes what we might call scientific evidence, which has certain features or constructs, but there's a broader set of research out there than what is typically falls into that bucket, right? And we have conversations about gold standards and qualitative research and improvement science research, and thinking about what counts is an important part of the discussion. I also referenced earlier the fact that practitioners and policymakers may have different definitions of research or different expectation for what counts than researchers do. So again, that is a hard choice when thinking about what you're going to try and capture in your survey. Those are some things that will, after you get to play with our survey a little bit, we're going to go through some of those hard choices and how they're reflected in our survey. Another set of design choices reflected some lessons learned. Keeping with that idea of defining or being clear about research, because people have different conceptualizations, it's not just what you're trying to capture, but the language you use. So when you ask a practitioner or a policymaker about whether or not they use research, it's unclear whether or not they are talking about the same thing as you. And so having to be creative in how you approach questions, and also you don't want to lead them, right? Like, you know, do you use research in your decision making? Of course I use research, right? As opposed to what kinds of things were useful in decision making. So those are the kinds of lessons that we're learning along the way. We did that in our blueprinting, some of our cognitive interviews, and we incorporated that into our design. Another lesson learned, we actually learned it, or at least got a heads up from our colleagues at NCRPP, the National Center for Research Policy and Practice, who attempted this before us. Pertains to lack of knowledge about how to critique or critically consume research, right? So knowledge about research is a hard thing to sort of capture, measure, and you sort of need to anticipate a broad range of abilities there, which has implications for how you ask questions and what you ask questions about. Lastly, the sort of combination of factors related to social desirability and perception versus behavior. Those are some things that are, Vivian mentioned in the plenary as well, right? The amount we can know about research use from asking people how they feel about research use, or, you know, how often do you think that you use research, or is your organization good at using research, right? So moving beyond perceptions, how close can you get to behavior in a survey? And we wrestled with that a lot, and we made some choices that we think could get us closer. Of course, not perfectly. We know that, you know, observation is probably our best strategy for getting at behavior, but what choices can you make in a survey to get you closer to that goal? Because of course, at scale, there's some trade-offs, right? We wanted scale, and so we had to think about some of these choices in our design. So to frame our sort of conversation around the strengths, the hard choices, and the lessons learned, we're going to use the work from our Center for Research Use and Education as an example for our conversation today. The Center for Research Use and Education is one of 2 IES-funded knowledge utilization centers, and a core component of that grant was measurement. And we proposed to do some work at scale, exploring the work of the practitioner community using research, the work of the research community in producing research, and some of the connections between them. And so because we proposed to do that at scale, we naturally chose a survey. And I'm going to pass it back to Henry now to talk a little bit about the instrument that we developed that I sort of previewed in our, oh, no, I skipped a slide, sorry. Underlying the work, of course, that informed our design was our conceptual framework. The citation at left is an article we published on that framework, but really we organized our center and the measurement work around some of these core ideas. At the bottom here, you see represented at left, practitioners' use of research. And on the right, we have depth, sort of research production. And we have a core set of ideas that we think are in common with those processes that are going to allow us to make some comparisons with our instruments. So at the top, we have gaps in assumptions and perspectives. And this is where we expected to see some differences between practitioners and researchers in terms of what they think research is, what kinds of products are useful, what the context in which their work mean for their use or production of research, and the relationship between research and practice. And so when we sat down to develop an instrument to capture these things, we have sections of the instrument that capture all of these constructs. So now I'll hand it over to Henry to talk a little bit about that.
Thanks, Liz. So you might have recognized in that graphic that there's a part at the bottom that is grounded very much in sort of behaviors, processes related to research use. Then at the very top, there's sort of like that 30,000 foot level, attitudes, perceptions, perspectives. And so essentially, we've got different parts of our survey to capture those different things. So the first part of our survey, depth of research use, gets at the bottom part of that graphic. And we've got parallel instruments for both the practitioners and for the research community. On the practitioner end, it's about use of research. It's about use of research among other forms of evidence as well, actually. And then on the researcher end, it's about production of that research and actually dissemination of that research to the practitioner community. But then the next level down in our survey battery, the gaps between research and practice section, that focuses on broader attitudes about the utility of research, the timeliness of research, the relevance of research, and the structures, processes, and incentives that support the connection between research and practice, both from practitioner perspective, but also from the researcher perspective. The third part of our survey, we're not going to be talking much about today, is a social network survey. There's in that graphic, as you saw, right, there's the 30,000 foot level, and then there's the what happens on the ground level. But all of that is sort of driven, you might have noticed, by a network of individuals. So there's a social network graph that is sort of overlays the middle of our conceptual framework graphic. And the truth is that the connections between research practice are so heavily driven by connections between individuals or connections between individuals and organizations or media sources. And so that's essentially what our social network surveys get at. A fourth component of our survey battery measures capacity to critically evaluate research. So, education professionals, they aren't trained as researchers. And so when you ask them, hey, do you think they did the right statistical analysis? Do you think they had a big enough sample size? Is this generalizable? Like, well, I don't know, go ask a researcher, right? At the same time, you can flip that coin on its head, because even though researchers might have capacity to critically evaluate research, how would they describe their capacity to actually engage with practitioners and get their research connected with practice? And so we've got a set of instruments there that gauge that capacity of practitioners to critically evaluate research, and of researchers to actually connect their research to practice and to build connections to the practice community. The last component of our survey focuses on brokerage. Brokerage is essentially any activity that is intended to connect research and practice. So you don't have to be a researcher to engage in brokerage type activities, but you can be. You can also be a practitioner, or you can be neither a practitioner or a researcher. Imagine, for example, many of you know who Sarah Sparks is, writes for Education Week. She engages in research brokerage through her publication of pieces in Ed Week that focus on research evidence, that actually get out into the field and publicize research evidence. And so that last part of our survey gets at that. The survey's been in development for a few years now. We've run through multiple pilots, including pilots in a few dozen schools, and as well as prior to that, a number of cognitive interviews, dozens of cognitive interviews to refine the instrument. The final version of our instrument is, we've just wrapped up our large-scale field trial. It includes a couple hundred schools, over 4,000 educators. And again, the survey was administered to all the instructional staff in the school. We, blanketed the entire school. And then our parallel instrument for researchers, we're wrapping up our field trial there. We currently have a bit over 400 respondents in that sample. And I don't know if we'll exceed 500, probably get closer, but probably not exceeding 500 by the time we close it out at the end of the year. I should note that the 5 dimensions of our survey, we've given them acronyms. So you'll see that we refer to them as 1R through 5R and 1S through 5S. And you'll see that referenced later on in the graphics. But they just basically tell you what component of the survey was it and whether it was for researchers or school-based practitioners. All right. So again, as I mentioned, there are parallel instruments for researchers and practitioners. The first section of the survey focused on depth of research use. It's actually anchored in a specific decision. So one of the first questions, actually the first question, asks the respondent, please identify a decision that was made in your school. And depending on their familiarity with an organizational level decision, we actually, for those that weren't or perhaps new to the school or weren't familiar, we actually asked them about a personal decision that they made that informed their own practice. And then we referenced that decision that they described for all of the items in that section that followed. Secondly, I want to point out that research evidence is one form of evidence that we're interested in capturing in our survey instrument, because a lot of information goes into informing decisions about policy and practice at a school level. And we wanted to be able to capture that, not just to be able to document all the different things that went into the mix, but also to compare the relative influence of different forms of evidence. Additionally, using a survey allows you to have a flexible definition of what constitutes research, right? Essentially what we did was we asked them, well, was external research used? Right? And then we were able to dig down more deeply to get them to tell us more about the details of what they were considering to be external research. Lastly, I want to point out that our instrument is specifically the first part of the instrument is focused very much on instrumental use. And the most commonly accepted definition of that is essentially use of evidence, use of research evidence to inform a decision. All right. Liz? The parts of the survey that we're going to be talking about today it's 3 of the 5 parts. So we'll focus on the first part of the survey, depth of research use, which really focuses on decision. It focuses on instrumental use of evidence, who is involved in the decision processes, and at what point was that evidence used. The second part that we'll look at is 2S, which is that sort of 30,000 foot level perspective. And that focuses on people's assumptions and perspectives about the utility, the relevance, timeliness, trustworthiness of research evidence, and the structures, processes, and incentives that may exist that to either promote or hinder the use of research evidence. And then lastly, we've got 4S in there, and that's our capacity scale. And that essentially is it's a classic, sort of survey scale gauging a latent trait. And it's a collection of items intended to capture the degree to which someone does or did not feel confident in critically evaluating specific aspects, technical aspects of a research product. I'm going to hand it back to Liz now, and she's going to talk more about the activity that we'll be engaging you in the workshop today, and the tools that we'll be using.
So we're going to give you about 10 minutes to individually test out an abbreviated version of the survey. It does not capture all of the sections that Henry reviewed, but the ones on the prior slide, the sections we're covering today, it does give you a taste of. We wanted you to have a chance to see the survey in action so you could think about some of the things that we just talked about, the lessons learned, the advantages of surveys, the hard choices, and look for how they're reflected. So to do that, I sent you the link in the chat. You can go ahead and jump on it. It will require a little bit of role play because it is the CS version, right? It's our practitioner version. So we want you to reflect on some of these questions, right? What aspects of research use are captured here? What choices did we make? And after up to 10 minutes, I'm going to reconvene you. And so you can, mute yourself, turn your camera off, whatever you want. But in about 10 minutes, I'm going to push us into some breakout groups where we'll have some conversation about what you experienced and observed with respect to the survey. So I'm going to go ahead and start that timer. Let me know if you have any questions or can't get into the survey.
And just to note, we will, at the end of the workshop, give you a link to the full version of the survey. So those of you that want to play around with all the different details can do so.
So can I go ahead and ask my question?
Yes, please do.
All right. So at the beginning, you describe a few different types of decision that could be considered in answering the questions. And one of them is about schedule changes. And the reason I ask about this is because we've done similar kinds of work investigating how people make decisions and what evidence they use for them. And there are these very transactional types of things for which it's really hard to find any evidence whatsoever. It's really like a practical decision. So I'm wondering whether you analyze those differently, put them in a different set, or even might consider discouraging people from using those kinds of decisions. Or maybe it's deliberate and you want to prove that point, that there are certain types of decision for which there's very little research that is relevant.
I think you hit the nail on the head.
Yes,
we were really interested in actually getting sort of a broad picture of decisions that are made in schools. Now, not that surprisingly to me, many schools are, many decisions in schools are sort of adoption-related decisions that could have potentially been informed by research. But yes, there are decisions, many of them out there that, well, what kind of research would I use to inform that? This is a transactional sort of, it's either HR related or something, right? Ironically, there actually is in our database a scheduling decision that was made that was informed by research.
They're actually, we've coded all of the open-ended responses for the different kinds, and I can definitely share a bit about what we found, and some cases where there is research, it's not particularly strong research, or there's research that is very conflicting. And so I think there's lots and lots of those cases. But I think I think our point is also to point out that the expectation for research use applies to particular decisions and not to others.
Yeah. And what you'll also see in our survey is that even though we had these questions where it was sort of like, when somebody responds and they say research was used, can you really trust that if it's just that one survey item? And so what we use is a bunch of
you're going to scoop yourself.
Dig into details. Yeah, I'm scooping myself, but it's okay to give the punchline first occasionally, especially if you're a reporter. You lead with the main point, right?
That was my timer though. So I am going to ask that folks get ready to have a conversation with their colleagues. I'm going to break us up into 3 rooms, and I'm going to post a little activity in the chat again. So this is a tool called Padlet. There's no app, there's nothing to download. You could just simply type some notes in, but it will help keep track of some of your ideas and questions, and also allow you to see, you can even like some of your peers' comments and questions. So I'm going to ask that in the Padlet, these are the questions that are posted. You're going to want to follow that link now so the chat doesn't disappear when I break you up into rooms. But please take a few minutes to have a conversation about what you experienced in the survey, questions you have, observations you have about the tool itself. So I'm going to go ahead and create those rooms. You can go ahead and join them anytime. I'm going to break you out in about 7 or 8 minutes. Welcome back, friends. It seems like we actually all made the journey and returned. Sorry about the tech issue. It's not actually a convening or a meeting until you have a tech problem. And so therefore, I feel that I have done my part to making this an official meeting. Feel free to continue to add to the Padlet personally at any time. I really enjoyed the comments and seeing the ideas come across. What we're going to do with the next section of time is go over some of the design choices we made in terms of those advantages, hard choices, and lessons learned that we referred to earlier, and then open it up to a broader discussion. One of the things we opened our conversation today with was hard choices. And specifically thinking about what counts as research and what counts as use. So we tried to take as broad a perspective as possible in the design of our questions about the kinds of evidence that inform decision-making. And we asked about a lot of different kinds here. I think there's more than 13. And wanted to give people a chance to think about the different kinds of evidence and not sort of predispose them to a specific kind of information that we were looking for. We also created in this question a way to value different kinds of research. So many of us are interested specifically in typical external research, right? Stuff created by maybe academics or research institutes that's available in articles, summaries, et cetera, et cetera. But there's other kinds of research that are valued, at least in our practice community, which is school-based educators. And that includes local research, things done by schools and districts, by teachers and principals, but even by youth. Thank you to Emily Ozer for bringing that onto our agenda. And of course, local data analysis. There's a lot of data use that happens in the education system, and a lot of people in our respondent group would identify that as research. And certainly we might think a bit about it on a continuum of research. So that's one of the ways that design choices we made about being flexible with what's considered research. And it gave us lots of choices with analysis because we could focus on any one of them or all of them in our conceptualization of research use. When it comes to what counts as use, as many of you already figured out, we really centered our work on instrumental use, and broadly defined as using research in the context of decision making. But even within that, we recognize that there's many different ways that research can come into a decision process, whether it's not necessarily just about identifying a solution to a problem, right, that typical adoption decision, but research can be used in various ways, including understanding implementation, identifying problems, and things like that. And so we tried to create as rich an opportunity for respondents to express research use, even in the context of instrumental use. That said, we also do value and recognize the importance of other kinds of use. We borrowed these items from our colleagues at the National Center for Research Policy and Practice. And they get a little bit of short thrift in our survey, but we do ask about them as well, even though our primary focus has been on instrumental use. I'm going to pass it back to Henry to talk about how we leverage the strengths of surveys in the CS instrument.
So, I mean, there's a few really key advantages to using surveys, and some of these are really obvious. Like when you do a survey, you can do an online administration and then reach lots and lots and lots of people with a relatively efficient platform, right? So, you know, our surveys now been administered to thousands of educators across the country. You know, you can only do that with a survey. The really cool thing about the online administration is that, and you guys recognize this probably, it's got 5 components to this battery, and it can take a while to complete. There are a lot of skip patterns in the survey depending on people's responses. You know, you get fewer or more items. You know, if the survey takes on average 25, 30 minutes for somebody to complete, let's say that they only have 15 minutes to work on it, they can stop there and then they come back the next day, they can pick up right where they left off, right? So that's an advantage of the online administration. Also, you can complete it on a mobile device. So, you know, they get home at the end of the day and they're like, you know, let me just, right? And they do it on their phone. So it was definitely an advantage to getting our response rates up. It is a long survey. It took a lot of effort to get response rates relatively high. And, you know, just so you guys know, there was a pretty substantial monitoring incentive to schools to get a high response rate from their staff. Each school could get up to $1,000 to participate in our study. Another advantage of the surveys is you can collect many different dimensions of research use, right? We had 5 different parts to our battery, and then within those, there are subdimensions to each of those. You could actually imagine taking our survey battery and pulling out any one part of it and saying, this is what I want to measure, right? And then it's only a 10-minute survey. But you can mix and match, if you will. Also, one of the cool things about surveys, and I think our survey in particular, where we didn't want to sort of identify people in advance, right? We didn't want to have to say, these are the key informants and these are the people we're going to go talk to. We wanted to sort of blanket the entire faculty in a school and allow essentially each person's role, their perspectives, their experiences to determine their pathway through the survey. So they got different questions depending on what, you know, they were bringing to the table. And so somebody that was familiar with an organizational-based decision, they were able to describe that decision and then the process that went into who was involved, what information was used, and what decision was made. Whereas other folks that weren't so familiar with an organizational decision, we asked them to talk about a decision that they personally had made to inform their practice as an educator. And then they got a parallel set of items that talked about that personal decision. And then another really key thing about surveys is that, you know, when you end up with responses from thousands of people and they're all seeing the same items, it allows you to do statistical comparisons of people in different groups and across different organizations. And so we're actually working to create some scaled up measures of depth of research use at the school level along, you know, the different dimensions that you saw in our conceptual framework. And so that allows us to sort of capture a number of different aspects of research use and the things that are related to research use at both the individual and organizational levels. All right. Liz, next slide. Okay, and then another thing that confirms the need to get multiple perspectives and the sort of speaks against identifying key informants in advance is that when you ask about the decisions that are made at the school level and you ask about who was involved in collecting the information, evaluating the information, and then making the decision, there's lots of people involved. It doesn't just fall on the principal. And so here you can see across the vast majority of decisions, you've got principals, teachers, curriculum and instructional leaders, assistant principals, instructional coach, special educators across the board are involved in making decisions and evaluating evidence. So getting their perspectives in a survey is really, really helpful. Liz? And then that other strategy that I mentioned is the ability to sort of like turn the survey into a choose your own adventure, right? So somebody that basically, you know, we asked them about an organizational decision and we said, although you may not have been involved in that decision, please tell us how familiar you are with it. And if they said, well, you know, I know about the decision, but I'm not really familiar with the information used or how it was gathered, where it came from, or who made the decision, what we did then is we passed them to a different version of the survey, which asked them about their personal decision. And so it allowed for that dynamic differentiation to get different types of research use, both at the organizational level and at the individual level. Related to that, we've got this ability to sort of examine the data both at the individual and the organizational level. So this is a series of box plots that just use our scale of capacity to critically evaluate research. So we've got a series of questions that ask folks about how confident they are in critiquing research. And you can see that most of the scores land in the I'm either not at all or only somewhat confident range, which is not surprising because educators, they're not trained as researchers. So why would you expect them to be able to say, oh yeah, they did a power analysis and had an adequate sample size? That sort of thing is just, it's not on their radar screen. But what you will notice is that for many of those boxes, there's outliers. There's a long tail on the assistant principal and principal box plot, right? So there are people who are in the mostly to very confident range. And so it's not like nobody's got any confidence in evaluating research. And one of my favorite anecdotes is there's this chemistry teacher in our sample that's like, yeah, very confident in almost every single aspect of this. Why? Because I got my master's degree in chemistry, and the whole time I was in graduate school, I was running a chemistry lab. So we did research projects all the time. And so that's one example of how, exposure and experience with research can actually push people higher up on this scale. That said, the prevalence of those outliers, well, guess what? When you look at this from an organizational perspective, it turns out that the vast majority of schools have at least one or more than one person in their school that's got a background that enables them to be very confident, mostly are very confident in critically evaluating research. But guess who they are? They're not necessarily the principal. They could be the chemistry teacher. They could be the special education teacher, right? And it often depends, and we've got data that suggests that it depends upon their past experiences and training. But what's cool about this is that when you think about school level capacity to critically evaluate research, there's potential there. It's about identifying the right people, though. Okay.
So I'll jump in. If you reflect back to some of one of our earlier slides on lessons learned, we identified 3 sort of areas in which we sort of learned lessons along the way, and they informed some of our choices in our ultimate survey design. So those include defining and being clear about research, anticipating lack of knowledge about how to critique or critically consume research, and the sort of favorable opinions versus behaviors. So let me walk you through some of the strategies we used, and you probably noticed in the survey you took. So first is that issue of perspectives versus behaviors, right? The tendency to report favorable opinions and social desirability. There's 3 strategies we use there. The anchor and reminder strategy, a second version of the dynamic differentiation. By the way, that's Henry's term, and he loves it, and he coined it. So if you use it, you got to credit him. And our follow-up strategy, which you've seen. So the anchor and reminder strategy, if you remember our open-ended question about problem and decisions, which you all got, that item, if you didn't notice, repeats itself. I mean, the response to that item repeats itself as you move through that first section of the survey. That keeps folks anchored in a specific case, right? It's not sort of their general perception. Did we, is research influential? No, we try and keep it as anchored to that decision as possible, which we think improves sort of our capture of what actually happened in that decision, right? Remember that we're trying to think about moving from perceptual to behavioral. We think that this is actually one strategy for getting closer there. Another way of thinking about this is the dynamic differentiation. So we can ask about familiarity with particular aspects of decision processes and then dig deeper. So many of you may have gotten questions about the sample size or the quantitative or qualitative nature of the research that was used, right? So those come as a result of differentiating the survey to get additional information. We also, I'm going to pump this one to Henry because this is his baby. So, and he did some great work on this. So take it away, Henry.
So when you ask folks, did research inform this decision? It's so often, well, of course it did. Trust me, right? And so essentially what happened in our survey, anytime somebody checked that box, it didn't happen in the version of the survey that you saw just now. We took it out, but the full version of the survey, if you check that box saying that external research influenced the decision, there was a follow-up item that appeared that, Liz, can you show it? So that read, okay, so please tell us about a research and evaluation study that influenced the decision, including as much information as possible about the study author, title, or URL, right? So we just asked them to follow up. And we weren't asking for like an APA style citation. You could just list an author's name. You could just tell us that, the organization that produced it, right? Give us a title of the book, any of that, right? It turns out that many of the people that said that, hey, external research was used, or even local research was used, or that local analysis was done, that when you ask them to follow up with additional detail with regards to the local external research, they said, yeah, research was used. But when you asked them to provide some detail, like, well, I don't know. Somebody else knows about that research. And so what we did was we used that as a filter item. So we went back and did qualitative analysis of those open-ended responses, took out all the I don't knows, blank responses, and then of the remaining responses, coded those based on whether we could find either the author, the title, or something like that in Google Scholar and having been cited 10 times, then we would consider it to be verifiable as research. The remaining responses, we basically just shoved them down and said, well, we can't count that as depth of research. So what you see is after using that filter item, the prevalence of the influence of external research drops dramatically. For local research, they just had to be able to say what the product was. Was it a report or a PowerPoint deck or something like that? And if they just said, well, I don't know, somebody did something, then it doesn't count, right? With regards to local data analysis, they had to be able to say something about who did the analysis, what data was analyzed, and what was produced. And if they couldn't tell us any of that information, we didn't count that either, right? The whole idea is that depth of research use is a function not just of actual use by individuals making the decision, but it's also about the degree to which familiarity with that evidence exists institution-wide in a school. Because if an individual teacher says that, oh, somebody used some research, but they have no idea what it was, we don't count that toward the depth of research use indicator. All right. Of course, when you think about, defining what constitutes research, there are varied definitions of that, right? You ask different people and they'll come up with different answers. And we want it to be as inclusive as possible in our survey instrument, but we also wanted to guide people. And so we do actually use a clarifying strategy that allows folks to, for those things that they see where you may not know, oh, well, what is that? What do they mean by research, right? You can click on that and it'll show you a definition. So in this case, the definition of research was systematic data collection analysis driven by research questions, right? And then there's that other strategy that we used. Go ahead. Right? Where we actually collected follow-up details. Then analyzing qualitatively the follow-up details from that open-ended item, we're able to categorize the types of research that influenced the decision. And for those things that we were able to identify, yes, this is verifiably either based in research or cited in the research literature, the vast majority of these were either books, they were things from program providers. So people would cite things like, oh, it's research by Orton Gillingham, right? Or it's a specific research author. And so essentially what we did was anybody or anything that was cited in Google Scholar at least 10 times, we took that as evidence that this was in fact research-based. So, things that might not be original research. So like John Hattie's book, Visual Learning, that showed up a lot. It's a huge meta-analysis of meta-analyses, right? But then again, there are some other things that showed up as well, like books or materials by Charlotte Danielson and her crew. And, some might argue that's not based in research, but it's cited in the research literature and it is researched itself. And so we counted that. All right, go ahead. Now, another thing we encountered, as Liz mentioned, is you had to anticipate that folks weren't really going to be, they're not trained as researchers, right? And so we had to use a clarifying strategy there when we're talking about specific elements of research. And when we wanted to gauge their capacity to critically evaluate research, we needed to ask basically self-efficacy questions. How confident were they in different aspects? Because if we ask them knowledge-based questions, like test items, like, here, read this research study and then tell me, was this a randomized trial? Was this a quasi-experiment? Or was it like, they're not gonna be able to get the right answers, right? Because they're not trained in that way. We learned actually from our colleagues at NCRPP that tried to develop a sort of instrument that you would almost see like as a final exam for an intro research methods course in a graduate program. They tried to develop that sort of an instrument to use with district level officials, and it just didn't work. And so that enabled us to sort of switch gears and say, well, if we're thinking that the reason it didn't work is because they don't have that skill set, we need to change the way we're measuring it. And we need to measure it in a way that simply verifies that, yeah, most people are just down at one end of the spectrum. Go ahead, Liz, next slide. So as I said, the clarifying strategy that we used for folks that really weren't familiar with concepts of research, right? You can click on any of these blue underlined things and it would give you a definition. And then with regards to those, with regards to those self-efficacy questions, instead of saying, giving them a test about, their knowledge of statistical analysis or sample size allocation, that sort of thing, we just simply ask them, how confident are you in your ability to critically evaluate whether or not a research study it included appropriate statistical analysis, had an adequate sample size? And as you saw in the previous slide that used the data from this, folks were pretty honest. They said, look, I'm not at all confident, or I'm only somewhat confident. And so that helped to confirm that really the broad idea that there's going to be critical consumption of research in the education community, the capacity to do so doesn't exist yet. It exists only for individuals that tend to be outliers. Okay, and now I'm passing it back to Liz to talk more about the limitations that we encountered in our survey and what we realized they just can't seem to do.
Right. So back to those, what can't we do, right? So we focused a lot on what we can do, what we tried to do to address some of the challenges in URE measurement, but there's some things that are just simply not good fits for surveys, right? So we felt it was very, very challenging to evaluate the quality of research used. All right, we're working on self-report. So even if they told us a good deal about the research, it's still hard to evaluate, right, the appropriateness of the research to the problem being addressed. We also had a hard time evaluating the quality of the use process, right? That's a complex social process, as we talked about earlier. And while we can get at pieces of it, right? So participation, stage of decision-making, right? Our construct around depth is organized in that way. There's a lot of pieces of that we aren't sure we're capturing as well as, let's say, an observation would be. We worked towards measuring objective behaviors, but we still had a good amount of evidence of social desirability bias, which, we should use some strategies for how we're addressing that. And that question of whether or not, moving away from perception items for some of our, especially for our context or broader big picture questions, we still needed to rely on perception items because we don't have the ability to sort of follow up on every single piece of information we wanted to get from them. So there are significant limitations, but also a lot of affordances to surveys. And we hope that this has been an opportunity to think through some of those and through the process of talking through our design choices. I was thinking about putting you back in small groups, but I want to be cognizant of time. We have about 9 minutes left. And so given the size of our group, I think maybe we can leave these open for conversation questions or reflections. I will note that Padlet continues to be open, and I have added these questions to that Padlet. And I'm going to give you the link again. If you'd like to offer any thoughts or reflections, I really appreciate that. It helps us think about our work when we talk about it with others. But for right now, let's open it up to a broader Q&A or comments. You guys represent many different fields and many different kinds of experiences. And so let's hear from you.
So there's been a few things that have come through the chat that I think we can just answer really quickly. So Stephanie asked about factor analytic work. And yes, we've done some factor analytic work, but we have not differentiated between K-12 or K-2 versus 3 to 5. I
answered many of the chats, so hopefully.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, don't worry. I was on it. Right. But if I didn't answer it adequately, please jump in and let me know that, and we can talk more about it.
I'm curious about whether you guys are finding more within school variance or across school variance.
Take a guess.
I would guess both, I think it would probably depend on the type of school or the school characteristics.
For most of our measures, it's within schools. It's driven by, and you can imagine, a first-year teacher is going to be very different from somebody who's been doing it for 20 years versus somebody who's a school leader. So there's tremendous amounts of within school variation. We are finding that there is enough school level variation to differentiate schools. But it's taken some work to get to that point, right?
And are you guys, Are you guys looking at all, I'll follow, excuse me for interrupting you, Taylor. Are you looking at all, or do you have any child level data that you can harvest from schools to look at relations at all or predictions from?
Not yet, but I mean, that is certainly a possibility in the long term. We didn't include that in this round of our research study, but yeah, we do actually know who the schools are that participated. We could link it to, you know, state level proficiency data. Yeah, we have not done that yet.
I was just gonna second Stephanie's first question because of just thinking about between level variance across the schools. You can expect that like leadership decisions would be, you know, more of like the meso level effect. If you took those sort of administrators out of your sample and looked at more of like the teachers, maybe you could potentially see some level 2 effects that way.
Yeah, and go ahead, Liz.
So I was going to say, because of the way we designed the survey, the individual versus school level effects sort of mean different things. I shouldn't even say effects, the variance. So within the first part of our survey, everyone's reporting on decisions. And so to some degree, you might expect variance because we're asking about different decisions. And like less variance would indicate more consistent practices across decision-making. But not necessarily mean the same thing as, for example, when we ask everyone how, you know, about their values and perspectives about research, where those are more individual kinds of characteristics. And so they sort of mean different things in different ways. But I think you're right. So, you know, Henry spoke earlier about different pathways through the survey. So if they didn't have familiarity with an organizational decision, they would respond to items about classroom decisions. And we haven't spent as much time looking at those data because sort of center in our work, we were thinking about schools primarily as our primary level of analysis. And so, but that is that is something we're going to do in the future. And I think it'll be really interesting to look at how, you know, that varies between the different kinds of respondents.
One of the things that we have done more of is differentiated across roles. So teachers versus administrators versus special educators or interventionists. And there we do see, you know, very different perspectives. Now, one of the reasons we're able to do that is because our sample sizes are much larger, right? Also, you know, I mean, the idea of looking at early elementary versus upper elementary, that's also intriguing. I definitely agree with you that, you know, when you think about, you know, the strength of research evidence to inform practice, one of the areas in which that research evidence is strongest is in early literacy. You know, the science of reading is you know, really very well established in the research literature, but unfortunately, as many people have sort of come to recognize in the past year or so, that it does not necessarily translate into practice across the board, and that many schools are actually using programs and curricula that don't have a strong basis in the science of reading. So, yeah, it's interesting. Off the top of my head, I don't think there were very many reports of organizational level decisions that had, I mean, there were a few probably. I remember Orton Gillingham showing up, but I have a feeling that those things are more related to, or more likely to be reported by special educators actually. Adoption of curriculum decisions, those broader, like district-wide decisions, happen relatively infrequently. But yeah, it's something definitely to think about. That said, I'm not sure that, you know, our ability to distinguish between respondents that are teaching at the K-2 versus 3 to 5 level, not so sure.
Fiona, you had a question?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure if it's well, maybe it's more of a question for everyone else. I'm trying to think about this question of how do we validate people's sense of whether they're really using research and how good they are at it. And I totally get that you're trying to avoid the mistake that was made by the other group which was, you know, what Henry May characterized as the final exam for a researcher. I thought those questions were ridiculous. It's like unbelievable. Like who thought to put them there? But in any case, the idea at least is good to try. I'm wondering whether, I'm assuming your survey is closed, but have you thought about maybe following up with some people and asking them what about that piece of research convinced them that it was worth paying attention to, or that actually influenced their decision, and see what they say?
Yeah. Liz, you want to respond to that? I mean, I would just say, look, we put a lot of eggs into the survey basket, but then we realize there's only so much you can do with surveys. So we need to have some follow-up. We need to do mixed methods work.
So we're in the process of doing some case study work based on our deep use schools, but we've also done some really, really rich case study work based on those open-ended items, right? So backwards tracking it all the way to the original researcher. So that's work that we can share another time and place, but it's been fascinating. I do want to be respectful of time, and I hate to cut you off because I could talk about that forever. But it is 4 o'clock. I am posting in the chat a link to the full survey, as well as a link to our website where you can access some more of our materials, some of our data points. We try and keep on top of posting things, but we'll get better over time, so keep checking it. If you have any questions for us, please always feel free to, you can reach out to us. You can follow us on Twitter. If you have any suggestions or would like to play with some data with us, we always welcome opportunities to have those conversations and broaden our work. Thank you guys so much for being with us. It's been really fun to share this, and I'm just grateful for the conversation and the engagement.
Thanks, Liz and Henry. Great seeing everybody.
Thank you so much.
Have a great weekend and a great holiday.
Okay, you too.
Happy Thanksgiving.